So now it's time for us to introduce our first speaker for today, Lawrence Hansen from the School of Medicine at the University of California, San Diego. The speaker bios are all available through the Resource Hub, so we're not going to repeat that when we introduce the speakers today. Lawrence will be focusing on animals in research and whether the extent of protection they are offered under law is enough to prevent them from unnecessary harms. So over to Lawrence to kick off today's talks.
Hi, my name is Larry Hansen. I'm a neuropathologist at the University of California in San Diego, and my specialty is in neurodegenerative diseases, but I also work in diagnosis of brain tumors and muscle biopsies and spinal cord. And I'm here to talk today. First, thanks very much for inviting me. I've always had an interest in animal welfare. And being at a research university kind of puts me in the belly of the beast when it comes to animal research because it goes on all around me. And I collaborate with people that do animal research, although I stay away from anything that hurts animals myself. So what I want to address today are three closely related topics: ethics, efficacy, and decision-making in animal research. First, to address some of the terminology, ethics, of course, is something right or wrong. Is it good or bad? You're already in an area of contention. The word right and the word wrong, pretty universally agreed upon when you're dealing with mathematics, maybe not so much when you're talking about ethics. And good or bad, well, that already implies a lot of subjectivity, whether you like strawberry flavored or you like butterscotch. One tastes good, one tastes bad. Who's going to argue about that? So it might be difficult to come to a consensus about ethics. Moving on to efficacy, I think we're more likely to be able to reason together. Efficacy means, does something work or does it not work? So for those whose ethics are rather contingent upon efficacy, for example, they would support animal research if they think it's going to cure cancer, but they wouldn't support it if they thought it was only being used to, say, improve something we know about basic science, but has no direct human benefit. They would say, therefore, it's not efficacious. So people who condition their approval of animal research on its efficacy for improving human healthcare, they can be argued with if you can document that animal research lacks efficacy in improving human health. If your argument is that the ends justify the means and the data shows that the ends are not produced by those means, then you might be able to diminish the support some people have for animal research. And then you get to decision making. So if you can't get people to agree with you about ethics, for example, that cruelty to animals is wrong, and you can't get them to agree with you about efficacy because they have a vested interest or a bias in not seeing the lack of efficacy of animal research, then you can get down to decision making where a decision is reached and people have to abide by it whether they like it or not. So when opinions differ about ethics and efficacy, who gets to decide? Because it does come down to money, and animal research is expensive, and the money in most places comes from the government, and the government supposedly is responsive to the will of the people. So if you get enough people who have ethical aversion to animal research, or enough people who are persuaded that animal research lacks efficacy, then we can elect representatives, and the representatives can control the purse strings and can end animal research whether the animal researchers want to or not. So who gets to make the decisions when there's differences of opinion about ethics and efficacy? So we'll start with ethics and take a stab at getting agreement as to whether it's right or wrong to use animals in research. And the first question is, can you argue about ethics or morality? Do ethics or morality impose any limits on how humans treat other sentient creatures? Or is it just everything comes down to whatever humans want to do? Does ethics just boil down to what Thucydides said in around 400 BC He said, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Well, the humans are strong and the animals are weak. And is that as far as ethics is going to go? Or is there any hope that we could get to an ethical consensus where most humans would say, no, there are limits to what we should do towards other sentient creatures who are capable of suffering? So I guess the first part of this talk is just an approach to the question of our ethics only people's subjective moral beliefs and sentiments, or can you employ logical arguments and disciplined analysis based on defensible propositions in ethical reasoning? Can you reason about ethics, or is it like trying to reason about whether you like chocolate or vanilla? Kind of a spoiler alert, Bertrand Russell, who was a mathematician who later became a philosopher, and he was also very sensitive to animal suffering. He famously concluded that I cannot see how to refute the contention that all ethics are subjective, but I refuse to accept that the only thing wrong with wanton cruelty is that I don't like it. Here's the essence of the ethical dispute in animal research. Those of us on the animal side just believe that cruelty to animals is always wrong, so we shouldn't do anything that causes animal suffering. And the people on the other side believe that the ends justify the means, and if the ends are sufficiently worthwhile or noble, then the animals are just going to have to suffer because the ends are so great. How do we address or attempt to resolve this kind of ethical dispute? Well, we've come a long way in scientific advances that have taught us that animals are not so different from us as perhaps we used to think. Evolutionary biology has shown us that, for example, I have more genetic homology with a male chimpanzee than I do with a female human, which explains a lot of the difficulty I have in my marriage. And there have been a lot of advances that question the moral anthropocentrism, which is based, at least in the West, on the biblical premise that humans are given dominion over all the creatures of the earth, and they're just there to be used as we intend to use them. That there's a dualism, that there's humans on one side of a thick black line and there's non-human animals on the other. But of course, science and biology and animal psychology have shown us that that's just not true. And now that we know that, does that imply that we can argue ethically that we might not be justified in using animals simply to satisfy our desires? The most extreme version of the moral orthodoxy of animals are here to serve us would be the contention that, well, bacon is yummy and who cares about the pig? I was trying to persuade a medical student once to think about becoming a vegetarian or maybe even a vegan and give up the bacon cheeseburgers because the bacon comes from pigs that are in gestation crates and the hamburger comes from cows that are in factory farms and they suffer so much just for a bacon cheeseburger. And he said, yeah, but if I didn't have a bacon cheeseburger, I would suffer. So, okay, that's that's the way a lot of people look at it. They think any deprivation that they would have to endure for the benefit of the animals is unethical because all that matters is what humans want. That's one way of looking at things. Another way of looking at it is when you see what goes on in animal research, most people are repelled by it. First impressions about cruelty are almost always correct. So when you see animals being treated like this, or like this, or like this, or like this, we tend to recoil in horror from this kind of thing. And you think, wow, maybe that is valid research, but it's just too horrible. It's just too cruel, and we shouldn't be doing this to animals. And then the people who want to do this to animals because they make their living doing animal research will resort to certain justifications. They say, well, humans are unique and only humans can reason morally or ethically, and therefore morality and ethics only applies to human interactions with other humans and not to our interactions with other creatures. Well, there's some problems with that ethical argument. I mean, yes, humans are unique, but all animals are unique in their own ways, so uniqueness isn't much of a justification. And there are some differences between humans and non-human animals. That's true, but not all differences are morally relevant. Some are morally irrelevant. Certainly, over the course of human history, skin color was thought to be a justification for treating some humans badly and other humans well. Sex and gender orientation were all historically considered good reasons for discriminating against women or homosexuals. Race, national origin, these were all thought to be ethically valid reasons for discrimination, and now we don't think that anymore. So perhaps sentience is more ethically relevant than species differences. And all of the science in animal psychology has shown that the more you look for evidence of human-like sentience in non-human animals, the more you will find it. That monkeys have a sense of fairness, that monkeys being given a cracker as a reward for a behavior are happy with that until they see another monkey being given a grape and they like grapes better. Then they will reject the cracker, not because they don't like crackers, but because it's not fair. So monkeys have an inherent sense of fairness, and we've certainly seen animals behave altruistically, sacrificing their interests for their young or for humans. And on the other hand, even if human uniqueness were considered a good enough argument to make a distinction between morality towards humans and morality towards non-humans, doesn't this imply that if we are uniquely capable of higher morality and ethical reasoning, we ought to use that to be nicer to animals? It ought to be an argument for us to treat animals more ethically rather than less if we are in fact so special. Well, those are sort of the arguments from the ethical point of view, that we should treat animals with kindness, or if we can't do that, at least leave them alone, at least don't torture them. I'm not forcing everyone to go to the animal shelter and adopt a dog, but don't use a dog for animal research, or a cat or a primate or any other animal that is capable of suffering. Okay, but if people are not persuaded by ethics, because you can't argue about ethics any more than you can argue about taste, what about efficacy? A lot of people condition their approval of animal research on the premise that they're going to get something from it. So if animal research would produce a cure for cancer, they would say, okay, the animals are on their own. Let's go ahead and do the research because I want my cancer cured. Well, that's an argument for animal research based on efficacy. Does it work or doesn't it work? Even that, I think, should probably be scrutinized, because efficacy in and of itself is not a very persuasive argument in some circumstances. I use the analogy that in the American South, before the Civil War, slavery was very efficacious in growing cotton and producing great wealth. So you'd say, well, then slavery is a good system. Well, only if you're not taking into account the slaves. So animal research, we're going to address its efficacy a little bit later on in this talk, may or may not benefit human beings, but you should always analyze the cost-benefit ratio of how much benefit for how much cost to the animals. But to get back to efficacy, pure and simple, does animal research lead to improved human health care? And would that be a sufficient argument to continue it? This slide shows there's really two arguments that the animal researchers will advance. The first argument at the top of the slide is, does animal research advance science? And the second argument is, does animal research lead to improved human healthcare? Let's examine both those questions. Here's an example of some research that I've been opposing for a long time, the last 30 years. It's research into what's called the vestibulo-ocular reflex. And what that means is our ability to smoothly track a moving object. So when you watch a bird flying across the sky, your eyes are smoothly tracking, and that's a very complicated neurophysiologic network that coordinates your cerebellum with your vestibular nuclei, with all the extraocular nuclei in your brainstem to move your eyeballs so that you can smoothly track a moving object. It's complicated. And so for 30 or 40 years, people at the University of California, San Francisco, have been investigating at a basic science level, how does that work? Because it's a pretty cool trick. And they've been doing that with non-human primates. And this is the 8 things they do to these non-human primates. They put titanium plates and bone screws into their skulls to restrain their heads. And they put eye coils into their sclera so that they can monitor where their eyes are moving. And they put cylindrical recording chambers in their skulls and electrodes into their brains in multiple locations. And it goes on. And I think maybe the most brutal is part 7, where in order to get them to track the moving object so they can make recordings from the cerebellum and the vestibular nuclei and the eyeballs, they dehydrate the monkeys, and the monkeys don't get any water until they visually track a moving object. And they do this to produce what they call a work ethic, to get the monkeys to track an object so they can make recordings. And to get the monkeys in the chair where they can make the recordings, they put a collar around their neck and they drag them with a pole. And they use the phrase, "We will escort them to a specifically designed primate chair." And so the primates look like this, with their heads bolted into frames and the collars around their necks. And this is what they look like when the recordings are being done. They're in a restraining chair to which they have been very kindly escorted. So the question is, does this work? And unfortunately, I have to grant that it does if all you care about is learning more about the vestibulo-ocular reflex. We do know more about how the vestibular nuclei coordinate with the cerebellum and how all of that input coordinates the movement of eye muscles so you can track a moving object. That's true. I just have to be honest about it. Basic science using animal research is efficacious. But is that enough? I mean, is it not just too horrible? When you look at what's happening to these primates, you can say, well, I could live with a little more ignorance about the vestibulo-ocular reflex, particularly nowadays, since with improved imaging techniques, we can get the same information from humans without doing all of the implanting and the electrodes. And technological advances in neuroimaging is allowing us to learn everything we were learning about the vestibulo-ocular reflex without hurting anybody. So maybe we would say, okay, yes, it's efficacious. We do learn basic science, but it's not worth the ethical cost. And actually, the people that do this kind of research, they recognize that when the general public gets pictures of what they've done to the primates, the support for that kind of research plummets. And so engaging in what we know as grantsmanship, when you're writing up a grant and sending it to the government because you want your research to be funded, even the people that are engaged in pure basic science without any clinical relevance, without any relevance to improving healthcare, they will disingenuously attach a few paragraphs to their grant. And their grant basically is about learning more, say, concerning the vestibulo-ocular reflex, but they will say, oh, but this may allow us to find the cause and a cure for many diseases of learning and memory, such as Alzheimer's disease, or shedding light on the normal functions of pathways that are compromised in many strokes and motor disorders, and potentially leading to new therapies for assisting in recovery from strokes. Well, I did Alzheimer's disease research for 40 years, and I was once listed as one of the top 100 Alzheimer's disease researchers in the world. And I have to call bullshit on this. I've published Alzheimer's papers. I've looked at Alzheimer's brains. I've collaborated with Alzheimer's researchers all around the world. I have never come across any reference to this monkey research on the vestibulo-ocular reflex. This is pure grantsmanship because so many people would say just for basic science, it's not worth causing the monkeys that much suffering. And they want to get around that by saying, oh, no, the monkeys are suffering, but maybe this will cure your Alzheimer's disease. That's not true. It is not efficacious for curing Alzheimer's disease. So they should fess up and say, if we're going to torture monkeys, it's for basic science and it's not going to improve human healthcare. But then people will say, yeah, but what about all the other animal research that does improve human healthcare? Well, back to efficacy. So how efficacious is animal research in improving human healthcare? Extrapolating from the results of animal research into human disease. Well, as this slide tells us, if you look at the data, meta-analysis, you look at hundreds of animal research studies, which in this case are aimed at coming up with treatments for human diseases. The example of basic science that I used, nobody really thinks that learning more about the vestibulo-ocular reflex is going to lead to a treatment or a cure for human diseases. But a lot of animal research sets out with the goal of coming up with treatments or cures for human diseases. And when you look at the data that's been accumulated in many meta-analyses and reviews, the take-home message is that it's nearly impossible to rely on most animal data to predict whether or not an intervention will have a favorable clinical benefit to risk ratio on human subjects. Why is that? Because human and animals are so different. Another meta-analysis on the efficacy of animal research in improving human healthcare looked at 248 references, and these references all addressed specific diseases for which animal models were being employed to come up with treatments or preventions. And this documented how high the failure rate is, trying to come up with vaccines for HIV and AIDS in monkeys, causing strokes in rabbits by injecting little pellets into their circulation, which is not at all like atherosclerosis in humans. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, multiple sclerosis, decades of causing experimental allergic encephalomyelitis in experimental animals, which does not mimic multiple sclerosis. Alzheimer's disease. Animals other than humans don't get Alzheimer's disease. So the animal researchers create these Frankenstein transgenic mice, and they put genes into them that are associated with Alzheimer's disease in humans, and then wait for the mice to develop Alzheimer's disease. And of course, they don't. And then menopausal hormonal therapy, cancer. How many times have you read in the paper about a major breakthrough in cancer therapy based on curing an artificial cancer in mice? So the data shows that animal research doesn't improve human healthcare. So if that's your justification for countenancing animal suffering, it's not a very good justification, even if it's a selfish one. I'm almost done with this, but yet more meta-analyses of animal research and its efficacy in improving human healthcare. In this one, 123 references found biases throughout animal research in design, reporting, publication, funding, and validation, leading to misleading results. Short take-home message is 89% of animal research cancer studies touted as landmark results in top-tier journals could not be replicated. And only 5% of animal research inspired clinical trials. In other words, they come up with something that works in animals, and so then they move it on to trying it out in humans. It turns out that only 5% of all of them should have been tested in humans based on the fact that the humans either didn't benefit or actually were hurt by the attempted treatments. So there's another long list of human diseases for which animal research models have been non-predictive of clinical outcomes in cancer, immunology, psychiatry, HIV, hepatitis, and prion disease. So those of us who are inclined towards kindness to animals will look at these studies of efficacy and say, okay, if we can't argue about your ethics, can we at least persuade you by appealing to your own self-interest? If you're approving of animal research because you think it's going to lead to improved healthcare and you're a human and that's all you care about, the data about efficacy shows that it's not going to improve human healthcare. So maybe that money could be better spent on human-based research. I'm a neuropathologist, and the big revolution in neuropathology has been based on genetic analysis of human brain tumors. The joke we use is we used to diagnose brain tumors on how they looked under the microscope, but now we realize if you want to know what something is, you have to pull their genes down and look at their junk. So all of the brain tumors that we used to lump in one category turn out to have different driver mutations. And some of those driver mutations are susceptible to therapeutic interventions, which we would never know if we were looking at artificial brain tumors induced in mice, which didn't have the same genetic drivers. So human-based research is what has been improving human healthcare, not animal-based research. But that's persuasive to us. And to be fair, we started out wanting to be persuaded. And it's true that we're easily persuaded that animal research doesn't benefit humans, but the people that do animal research are not going to believe those meta-analyses. They're going to argue about the statistics. And they're going to invoke a quote from Mark Twain, who said there's lies, there's damn lies, and then there's statistics. And if you torture statistics long enough, they will confess to anything you want. So no amount of what we think of as rational analysis of animal research efficacy will persuade people who want to do animal research that it's not improving human healthcare. A man sees what he wants to see and disregards the rest. I'm dating myself. I don't know how many people in the audience even remember who Paul Simon is, but that's a lyric from one of his big hit songs called The Boxer. So those of us who agree we can't persuade people ethically because ethics are subjective, unfortunately, and probably we can't persuade them logically based on efficacy because they don't want to be persuaded. We have to confront the fact that humans are biased towards seeing ourselves as less biased than average. And certainly those of us who oppose animal research are exceptions to that rule. We are not biased, but the animal researchers are. And all these psychological studies just prove how hard it is to influence decision-making with rational analysis. At least you can't influence decision-making by people who are biased against being persuaded. We're likely to see, we need twice as much information to change our mind as we do to support our preconceived notions. When people get in groups, interestingly enough, like-minded people in groups tend to become extreme. We don't go towards the middle. So you get people who agree with one another. They become more and more extreme in what they agree about. So animal researchers getting together agree more and more about how justified animal research is. And those of us who disapprove of animal research become more and more convinced about how wrong it is. So given all this, like-minded people gravitating towards extremes, groupthink, there's not going to be that much hope that we're going to ever persuade the animal researchers to give up their animal models. And we might not even be able to persuade people who are neutral about it, because it's difficult to persuade people of anything. So what's the next step? Well, we have to go to the source of animal research, which is money. It comes down to money. If we can't persuade people about personal ethics, it turns out maybe we can persuade them about laws. So laws are codified ethics. And all of the constraints that have ever been imposed on animal researchers in the law have originated from public outrage over exposés of animal cruelty. None came from the animal research industry itself. So what is the public? The public that might not be prejudiced towards our side of things or prejudiced towards the animal researchers' side of things, what do they think? Well, humans being humans, there's kind of a range there. But the polling seems to show us that people occupy a middle ground between our side and the animal researchers' side. They will approve of animal research, but only in a contingent way. They don't approve of extreme suffering, and that's why when animal rights advocates sneak into laboratories and film what's going on, for example, with that primate research, and then they show those movies to the general public is outraged because that suffering is too extreme for them to countenance for mere basic science. Their disapproval of animal suffering is nuanced, though, because if the animal researchers can persuade them that the research is going to cure diseases, then they think, well, okay, maybe we'll approve of some animal research if it's going to improve human health, but it shouldn't be too extreme, and it has to improve human health. And we don't want them to be researching on primates or dogs and cats. I think the short version of that is the public doesn't want animal research conducted on primates because non-human primates are so much like us. And they don't want research on dogs and cats because dogs and cats like us so much. And they feel like it's a hideous betrayal after 10,000 years of selective breeding to get dogs to love humans to then turn around and treat them the way animal researchers treat them. But the public is more tolerant of research with mice, rats, and fish. And those of us in the animal rights community still think you ought to leave mice, rats, and fish alone. And our argument is that the animal research, even on those non-favorite species, doesn't lead to human healthcare improvements, and the money could be better spent on human-based research. So again, we try to persuade with arguments about efficacy if we can't appeal to ethics. Getting close to the end now, what has happened is, as a result of public outrage due to exposés of animal research, the outraged public is represented by, in the United States, congressmen and senators, and they urge the congressmen, the senators, to pass laws to restrain the vivisectors so that they don't engage in research which is too cruel, and they don't pay for research that doesn't have any applicability to improving human health care. So in the United States, that resulted in the mandated IACUCs, which stands for Institutional Animal Care and Use Committees. So those were mandated by Congress in response to the outraged public. Prior to that, there had been no restrictions whatsoever on what animal researchers could do. But the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committees were established so that public money in the form of grants from the National Institutes of Health and the National Institutes of Aging wouldn't be distributed to researchers who used animals until they passed a IACUC committee. And the IACUC was intended to be a brake on out of control animal cruelty. And the IACUCs were supposed to, before they approved of any government funding for animal research, take into account two things: is how much suffering is involved and how much benefit is there going to be to human welfare. Basically, they were supposed to do a cost benefit analysis. Are you getting enough bang for the buck? Are you turning down the cruelty, and are you turning up the efficacy? And it was a noble effort. It was a great try. But the IACUCs are based at research universities, and research universities, trust me, I've been working at one for 40 years. Research universities are funded in large part by grant money. And so they did a very clever end around. They realized that the intention of the IACUCs was to protect animals and make sure that research was only done if it had a potential benefit for humans. But they knew how to Shanghai the IACUCs. So it turns out that the research universities were allowed to make up the composition of the IACUCs. And nowadays, institutional animal care and use committees are dominated by vivisectors. So 67% of IACUC members are animal researchers. 15% are institutional veterinarians who are hired to support animal research. And 93% of the IACUC chairs are animal researchers themselves. They all claim, of course, that this doesn't influence their judgment. But that's sort of analogous to saying a committee of wolves would claim to be very unbiased about how sheep ought to be treated. Anyway, so IACUCs have been shanghaied by animal researchers, and now everything gets approved. 98% of all research proposals are approved by the IACUCs because the IACUCs are populated by animal researchers. Still, it was a nice try. So other legislatures have attempted to basically constrain animal researchers by passing laws, and the European Union has done a better job, and presumably this represents the wishes of 500 million Europeans. So last slide is there any hope for the animals? Well, I think so, but we can't appeal to people's ethics because that's too subjective, and efficacy doesn't seem to work because people are too biased in their analyses of efficacy. But I don't want to despair. I think the only lesson is laws that have restrained researchers, or in this case, historically, you can imagine that the bear baiters who were forbidden from bear baiting didn't want those laws to be passed. And all of these are examples of improvements in animal welfare. These are all things that people used to do and that used to be legal, but they were eventually outlawed. And I think that's the only way to go for those of us who care about animals, is to elect people who care about animals who can pass laws to restrain the animal researchers. It's a slow, laborious process, but I think when we look at ethics, efficacy, and decision-making, it comes down to decision-making. If they will not be ethical, we can substitute legality for morality, and that's the only thing I can think of to do for them. Thanks very much.
Okay, Professor Lawrence Hansen now joins us live from California, where I believe it's early evening. Good evening, Larry. It's great to have you here with us today.
Good evening.
Obviously, we have some very close similarities between Australia and the US, but also some differences as well. And so we have a plethora of questions that have come through from our audience, but I just wanted to get kick-started with a bit of a thought starter, and this does relate to some of the questions that have come through. Just recently, there was an Australian study published which piloted a rat model for strangulation as a way to study the health impacts of intimate partner violence. While I don't expect you to comment definitively on that particular study without knowing the details, what do you think about the premise of setting up a new animal model for human injury modelling like this without having any validation of its effectiveness, reproducibility, or translatability to the human condition?
Well, I think it's a classic example of for a man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So this is a new trendy thing in young people's sex, is strangling each other. Different strokes, I guess. And so animal researchers, their raison d'etre is to put in grants and get the money, and that pays for the overhead of the university. So everybody in the university, they have a vested interest. So the first thing they would think of is, well, strangulation is a problem. Let's strangle some animals and see what happens. It seems to me is a pretty crude and unlikely to be beneficial approach, given the differences in the neuroanatomy of rats. They have different selective vulnerabilities. They have different cerebral circulations. I think they rarely strangle each other during sex naturally. So it just seems like the typical same old story is, oh, here's a chance to get grant money, and there's not much biological plausibility behind that. It's the same reason that all those stroke studies in rabbits didn't work. They say, well, strokes are the result of plugged vessels, so let's put some plastic beads into the cerebral circulation of rabbits, plug the vessels, and there's a model of strokes. And of course, it turned out that that's not at all the way strokes work in humans. That it has to do with atherosclerosis and thrombosis. And I'm an old professor, I could go on for hours and hours, but there are just so many differences anatomically and pathophysiologically that it seems ludicrous. Animal models worked hundreds of years ago to figure out the circulation of the blood, which Harvey figured out in the 1600s. But a lot has changed in the 1600s. So I just think, particularly with all of the modalities we have in neuroimaging in life, without any experimental intervention, that just seems a stupid way to approach the problem.
Yeah, just if I could pick up on that line of the amount of information that we're now getting from the human condition, I guess. Do you think there's a bigger role for big data and collecting more from human medicine and having more access to that for researchers to get much more translatable and meaningful data into the future?
Short version, yes, of course. I mean, yes, you're right.
Yeah, okay, thank you. We've got lots more questions to get through. So this one here, do you believe that there is enough support for animal technicians in general for them to be effective whistleblowers as part of their duties here in Australia for when researchers might overstep their allowed welfare infringements? And if not, what measures would you suggest to help support them to prioritise animal welfare?
Now, of course, I'm not familiar with the ins and outs of what goes on in Australia. I know that in America, they pay lip service. Well, I mean, that whole IACOC stuff I was talking about, institutional animal care and use, that's another example of the truth of an old expression, which is that hypocrisy is the complement that vice pays to virtue. So the hypocrisy of the universities and the animal research industry is that they will say, well, we have IACOCs to protect the animals, and they don't, because as I mentioned in the lecture, they're all wolves guarding sheep. And then they'll say, oh, we have whistleblower protections for techs who will supposedly call a hotline, but the hotline goes right to the university administration, and the university administration's highest priority is to continue the money running through the pipeline. So it's all a setup that I think most of it is just for show, to try to placate the public, because that's amazing is the more the public learns about how horrible animal research is, the more they come over to our side. And so that's one of the reasons why, for example, at University of California, San Diego, you're not allowed to go down to where the animals are kept. They're kept in these large cavernous spaces underground in cages, and you can't just go down there and see the monkeys that are being tortured. They want to keep it away from the public, but fresh air and sunlight is the best disinfectant. The more people know about what's going on, the better off initiatives will be to pass laws to protect the animals.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really great segue to our next question. Kimberly would like to know your thoughts on whether people have a right to know or not know about the abuses that occur behind closed doors. And she goes on to list other areas like farms, shearing sheds, abattoirs, live export vessels. And if people do not want to know, does that mean that they already know that there's something unpleasant and don't want to have to deal with the mental consequences of seeing it, and then having to change their own thoughts and beliefs? Do you have some thoughts around changing people's perspectives and what transparency might do in that regard?
Well, first answer is certainly when it's public money that is paying for the research, people have a right to know. It's our tax dollars that are paying for these grants, and they should absolutely be open to the public. It's our money, we're paying for it, we have a right to know what's going on. When it comes to, say, PETA people going undercover to expose animal abuses in gestation crates and factory farming, they're taking a risk there. I think they're doing a noble thing. I don't know legally whether they have a right to do that, the way the public has a right to know what goes on with publicly funded research. And as far as people not wanting to know, I don't want to feel like I'm bad-mouthing my dad. I already mentioned he was the one who came up with when I was trying to persuade him to become a vegetarian, he said that, but bacon is so yummy. And I tried to explain to him, and my dad was in the middle of the bell curve. He wasn't a bad guy. He was smack in the middle of the bell curve of human compassion, neither exceptionally good or exceptionally bad. And so I started to tell him about what the conditions were. And he says, well, just don't tell me about that. I don't want to know about that. So I think he would be revolted if he was forced to see it, but people, they know it's there. And our ability to deceive ourselves, to ignore unpleasant realities is practically unlimited. So those are the kind of people you kind of think, well, maybe there's a wedge there. You could get to them because they don't want to know, but their desire for yummy bacon is greater than their moral curiosity. So yes, people who say, don't tell me, I don't want to know, they really know, and they do it anyway. But in full disclosure, then if you live in glass houses, shouldn't throw stones. So I'm a vegetarian, so the pigs are better off, and the cows are better off, and the chickens and the turkeys, but I still eat fish. And I know it's wrong. I mean, I know the fish suffer, and I do it anyway. So somebody once said, well, the fewer animals you make suffer, the better. So that's my rationalization. And Mark Twain said, man is not the rational animal, man is the rationalizing animal. So you just need to get to the place where fewer and fewer people rationalize their way into habits that hurt animals.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting takeaway, and it links very nicely to one of our talks that we had yesterday. So very interesting aspect there. There's a couple of questions coming through. One's from Noel and one's from Daisy, and I might just group them together because of the sheer number. Questions around animal-based research for the benefit of animals, and do the needs of many outweigh the rights of one in that regard? And also, do you see, I guess, an ethical justification for those sorts of studies that could benefit humans and animals?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think animal research for the sake of animals, you have to do what the IACUCs, and I'm sure the Australian equivalents are supposed to do, is you have to do a cost-benefit ratio. You have to say, if there really is a huge benefit and the animals don't suffer too much, then I can balance those two and go ahead and do the research as long as the animals don't suffer too much. And of course, that's subjective again, what is too much? But I think it's ethically justified for minimal suffering for great benefit. But when you get down, you could say the same thing about humans. You could say, well, I mean, the best model for human diseases is humans. So why don't we just take a few humans and treat them horribly? And that's going to give you much more reliable results. But I mean, suppose the Nazis had come up with a cure for cancer. Would you say, well, that was justifiable? I would say, boy, I would use the cancer cure, but it was not ethically justifiable. And when people say there's no other way to do it but by causing a lot of suffering, my response is, well, you claim to be a smart guy. You want us to give you money to pursue your smart ideas. Find another way. I think there's almost never only one way to do something. So I think if it was much harder to just immediately as a default position start harming animals or other humans, I would ask the questioner, would it be okay if a great number of people benefited to treat some humans horribly? Or would you just say, no, find another way to benefit the great number of people? And I guess that's what I would say about using animals, both to benefit animals and to benefit people.
Thank you. Don't have a lot of time left, but I just want to pick up on this funding sort of line that has followed through a lot of this. How do you think we get over that hurdle of ensuring more funding? Because this is a big conversation in Australia at the moment, is there's very little funding for alternative-based research. There's a great white paper that was released by the CSIRO positioning Australia as potentially a future leader in this space of non-animal alternatives, because we have laboratories already set up at a small scale. But if there was just enough money to really ramp that up hugely, so that there would be a much bigger push for that, and researchers would therefore feel more confident, I guess, shifting from what they've been trained. And this is something that we see over and over again, is researchers train their PhD students and their honours students in their old way of doing things using animals, and then of course you start publishing using animals and they find it hard to transfer over to non-animal models. So how do you think we get over that hurdle and convince government to put much more money towards non-animal alternatives?
Yeah, you ask really hard questions, really hard questions. The efficacy argument is, if you could appeal to people's self-interest or their perception of their self-interest, if you could persuade enough people that animal research has less efficacy in helping cure human diseases than human-based research does, and I tried to use that example about brain tumors, and there's all sorts of other diseases where animal research has brought no results, and human-based research has. It's such a lame, painful answer to say that you have to elect people who will pass laws that will say that we're not going to fund animal research anymore, and then all the incentives will be to find non-animal human-based research alternatives to get the money going again. So you have to pass laws in Congress, and again, the ace in the hole is that people pursuing their self-interest or people horrified by how horribly animals are treated are more inclined to elect representatives who might pass laws that will restrict the use of animals and will emphasize the more efficacious use of human-based resources. Another quote that I really like is, he's not really from one of my heroes, but most famous criminal in American history is a guy named Al Capone. And he once famously said, I have found you get much further in life with a kind word and a gun than you can with just a kind word. Well, nobody's going to pull a gun on the animal researchers, but passing a law is our modern civilized equivalent of a gun. And we have to do that to change behavior. We can't do it ethically, so we have to do it legally. Stop asking, is it right or is it wrong? Force them to ask, well, is this legal or not legal? And the only way to make it illegal is to elect representatives who can pass laws to make it illegal.
Excellent. Thank you very much for wrapping up with that comment, Larry. I think it's one of the areas of significant change that's coming upon, hopefully, many of our countries in the world, and look forward to seeing the future of that. So thank you again, Larry, for your presentation and for joining us for the Q&A.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you.